Okay, here's a hypothetical for you. Imagine one day you'd checked your bank accounts and realized that someone had somehow gotten in and taken a hefty chunk of your money from you overnight. That'd be pretty bad, wouldn't it? But now imagine that you were already struggling to make ends meet. Perhaps you were behind on some payments, or perhaps you had kids or dependents that relied on you. Basically, every last cent was needed to keep you from poverty. And well, the theft just made everything so much worse. But imagine that we're not talking about just one person's account, but instead the wealth of an entire country. You see, in Moldova in 2014, no less than $1 billion was stolen from the state banking system, and the money was transferred out of the country. The resulting deficit was converted into public debt, meaning the Moldovan taxpayer had to effectively eat the entire cost of the robbery. And by the way, Moldova has a nominal GDP, or total state wealth, of about $19.5 billion in 2025. Per capita, it is the poorest of the 48 countries in Europe, and even then, $19.4 billion is still twice what Moldova's GDP stood at in 2014. So yeah, in 2014, Moldova's entire state wealth was $9.4 billion, meaning that year's robbery had taken away around 12% of its entire GDP. Now, finally, imagine that the person held as responsible for such an apocalyptic level of fraud was not in prison, not living in shame, but instead living comfortably abroad. No doubt, they got a lot of money. All while supporters organized protests back home in his defense, and that even there was a political party which still bore his name. Well, if you can imagine all this, you can imagine the case of Ilan Shor and the Great Moldovan Embezzlement Scandal, one of the worst state robberies of all time. As you might know, the fall of the Soviet Union and communism came with great ills for most of the former constituent republics and their populations. While most managed to avoid complete political meltdown, what came post-1989 was years of social crisis, corruption, lawlessness, massive inequality, economic destitution, and often mass immigration. Moldova, a small nation on the eastern fringe of Europe, suffered just as much as anybody else. Even in the withering days of the USSR, it was one of the poorest Soviet republics, having no heavy industry of its own and being largely reliant on Moscow for subsidies. That safety net went out the window when the Union disbanded in late 1991. Unlike many other transitioning states, Moldova even suffered domestic political instability as separatists in the Russian-speaking region of Transnistria fought a 2-year conflict to secede from the mostly Romanian-speaking rest of the country. This resulted in around 1,000 deaths, steep ethnic division, and a Russian military presence in the breakaway region. And unfortunately, things didn't get a whole lot better after the conflict entered frozen status in July 1992. In the following decades, steep emigration caused Moldova's population, excluding Transnistria, to shrink by approximately 35%. The number of inhabitants tumbled from 2.9 million in 1989 to around 2.4 million by 2024, with the median age rising from around 28 years to around 38 in the same period. At the same time, the state suffered from an atrocious rate of corruption, with 37% of Moldovans reporting having paid a bribe of some kind in the year 2010, according to Transparency International. Average life expectancy faltered too, falling to just 66 years in 1996 before mildly rebounding to around 72 today. This gives Moldova the lowest life expectancy in Europe, lower than Russia, and even lower than the world average at around 73 years. And yet, amidst all those troubling statistics, one stood out perhaps more than any other. In 1990, on the eve of independence, Moldova's GDP was a paltry $3.5 billion. As the hardship of the following years took effect, this withered to a little over $1 billion in 1999 before gradually rising in the 21st century. And yet, state wealth nosedived once again from $9.4 billion to $7.8 billion between 2014 and 2015. At a glance, there'd be little to explain this. Because, like many other countries, Moldova's GDP had suffered a hit at the height of the financial crisis in 2008, but had otherwise risen modestly and consistently every year since rock bottom in 1999. While nearby Ukraine and Russia's GDPs also took a severe downturn in 2015, the former was in the midst of the fallout from the Maidan protests and the war in its eastern regions. The latter, meanwhile, was being bitten by a fall in oil prices and international sanctions owing to its role in Maidan and the war in Ukraine. Moldova was not at war, nor did it have any significant oil exports that could be affected by the falling prices. All should have been relatively well, but you already know the reason for this sudden financial downturn. Something that had been brewing beneath the surface for several years was unmasked, and its fallout continues to mark the country to this very day. In November 2014, 3 of Moldova's biggest banks were in critical condition: Unibank, or UB, Banca de Economie, or BE, and Banca Sicilia, or ironically, BS. All 3 had provided hefty loans to offshore shell companies and other murky firms, loans which were now leaving a gaping deficit of around 18 billion Moldovan lei, which is equivalent to around $1 billion. On November the 27th, the government placed the banks under administration and made plans to liquidate them. Understandably, the public demanded answers. How on earth could 3 major financial institutions fail their duties so spectacularly? With many questions and few explanations, the government and the National Bank hired American risk advisory firm Crolling to investigate, and what they found shook the country to its core. It turned out that in the previous years, all 3 banks had undergone separate, insidious kinds of infiltration. Unibank had been owned for years by Vienna Capital Partners, an Austrian corporate finance company. But in 2012, unbeknownst to anyone, 100% of its shares were sold to new stakeholders, each of whom owned under 5% of the total stock. Now, this was significant, because under Moldovan law, shareholders who own over 5% of a company's capital must be approved by the National Bank. Those holding under 5% don't need such approval. That threshold, by the way, was intentionally designed to be tighter than in other jurisdictions, given Moldova's experience with weak banking governance and endemic corruption. But the fact that some of those stakeholders had bought shares worth exactly 4.99% did nothing to make any of this look above board. Similar patterns were revealed at BE and BS. On paper, all of their shareholders were independent entities and individuals. Yet as soon as investigators scratched beneath the surface, what they found was a web of accounts belonging to shell corporations, all of whom were traced back to one man, Ilan Shor. The National Bank went on to identify no less than 77 companies involved in suspicious transactions, and everyone was tied directly or indirectly to Shor. The Kroll report labeled this cabal the Shor Group, a name that would gain notoriety as more details about the Great Moldovan Bank robbery began to emerge. Ilan Shor wasn't, at that time, a particularly well-known figure yet. Born to Moldovan Jewish parents in Israel, he had returned with his family to Chisinau as an infant in 1990 as the Soviet Union began to fall apart. His father, Myron, founded the Duframol, Moldova's largest seller of duty-free goods, in 1994. By adulthood, Ilan had taken over the directorship of his father's company, meaning that even if his name had not yet become well known, he was already rather wealthy by the time it did. But wealth probably wasn't the only thing Ilan inherited from his father. Myron was a well-connected figure who'd reportedly returned to Moldova on the personal invitation of then-President Mircea Sneager. Shor Sr. was also linked to Boris Berstein, an oligarch known for multiple murky business dealings, some of them reportedly on behalf of the Soviet Union, and for his alleged links with the Russian mafia and the KGB. Whether through his father or not, Ilan cultivated business connections and a deep cultural affinity with Russia, later describing Moscow as his favorite city and marrying a Russian Jewish pop star, Sarah Manakhanova, in 2011. The thing is, while a 27-year-old Ilan was no doubt plenty wealthy in 2014, he probably wasn't so wealthy as to have single-handedly bought all those stakes in Moldova's banks over the previous years. There had to be more to the tale. So, Kroll went to work, taking a closer look at the corporations now linked to one of the worst financial heists in history. Many of those turned out to have Latvian bank accounts. Loan funds would leave Moldova, be routed through those accounts in Latvia, and distributed into a complex web of offshore companies in places like Cyprus, Estonia, and Russia. Pretty soon, it turned out that many of the supposedly Latvian corporations shared physical addresses with known Shor Group companies, and even had the same directors, nominee owners, accountants, and associated phone numbers. And it got worse. Individuals connected to Shor or loyal to him sidled into management positions at the 3 banks, which collectively accounted for about a third of Moldova's entire banking sector in the early 2010s. From there, those appointed to senior positions were able to influence loan approvals from inside. For example, in 2012, Varo Melnik, a partner at Shor's company Duframol, was appointed head of the board of directors at Unibank. That same month, Sergei Albot, another Shor acolyte, became vice president of the same bank. Unibank soon increased loans to Shor Group companies by $500 million Moldovan lei, or about $30 million. And the insider agents even moved about between the banks, as if with impunity. In 2013, the president of Banca Sociale resigned and immediately took over the vice presidency and later full presidency of Banca de Economie. This probably was enough to make the Kroll investigators' head spin. But in March 2013, the conspirators made a mistake. Banca de Economie signed a deal to cede non-performing loans to a UK-registered organisation called the Rousseau Alliance for about €51 million, a transaction that made no obvious sense. Non-performing loans were loans deemed unlikely to ever be repaid, which made them worthless on the commercial market. So why would a British company be interested in high-risk loans from a Moldovan bank of all places? The actual purpose of this agreement revealed itself to the investigators. By getting rid of the bad loans and securing 51 million euros in exchange for them, Banca de Economy looked like it was in good health, thereby increasing its loaning ability to Shore Group companies. A few months later, Rousseau had lifted another pile of bad assets from the bank's books, this time worth around 15 million euros. This Ponzi-like structure was too questionable to not be eventually revealed, and when Banca de Economy finally came under scrutiny in 2014, it rescinded both deals, probably to clutter up the trail of paper and avoid revealing the truth. Because what all of this amounted to was a massive money laundering operation that extended to multiple countries. And through the complicated flows of cash, it was hard to see how anyone made money, but they did. Between 2012 and 2014, around $2.9 billion worth of loans flowed into Shore Group accounts. Much of the funds would then travel through several more foreign accounts, being split up and added to legitimate funds, thereby helping to hide their source. The fraud stretched all the way into Asia, as Kroll discovered suspicious transactions involving accounts based in Hong Kong. And the sheer complexity of the crime had made it difficult to even know exactly how much money was stolen. Ultimately, while most of the $2.9 billion was wantonly cycled around in Moldova to pay off other debts, it was concluded that up to $1 billion was irretrievably siphoned away. As much as it took a long time for all of this to be discovered, it would take even longer for the state to recover. And in many ways, it is still recovering. Now at this point, you're probably wondering, how on earth could Ilan Shor get away with such blatant fraud? Well, the answer is that he couldn't. Not forever. But by the time he was exposed, he'd be able to put in place a contingency plan, even while the fraud furiously accelerated. In the autumn of 2014, all three banks were fit to collapse. Among their greatest debtors were, unsurprisingly, Shore Group companies, who collectively owed them around $500 million. But incredibly, the banks continued to approve loans, and this despite the fact that the government had already begun to place the banks under keener scrutiny. Government investigators appointed representatives to Banca de Economy's board of directors, but conspirators on the board undermined their efforts to establish facts, such as by failing to alert their new colleagues to upcoming meetings. At this time, in late 2014, the cabal knew their elaborate scheme was coming to an end. So, what came next was a flurry of last-ditch activity. In the month of November alone, all three banks loaned a further 13 billion lei, or around $880 million, to the Shore Group. At the same time, across all three banks, around $350 million were paid back using funds previously loaned to other Shore associates. Money circulated wildly in a sort of reverse Ponzi scheme, or more simply an attempt to tidy up the damage that was soon to be oh so revealed. The furious covering up of tracks reached its zenith on the 26th of November. Banca Sociala already owed billions of lei, inexplicably approved several massive new loans to Latvian accounts owned by British partnerships. The same day, documents and electronic records about loans from all three banks mysteriously vanished. Banca de Economy management ordered staff to move key documents to an off-site archive. What followed was almost comedic. The head of the Department of Management watched as the files were loaded into a van and was driven off. The next day, it was reported that the van had been stolen and set on fire, along with all of its contents. It turned out that the van was owned by Classica Force, a transportation company owned by, you guessed it, Ilan Shor. But soon the gig was up. By the end of the year, all three banks were placed under administration just as the Kroll investigation was about to begin. The investigation into Ilan Shor and the Great Moldovan Robbery revealed many things. One of those, almost unbelievably, was another, even larger fraud. While Kroll was digging into Shor's plundering of the three Moldovan banks, a journalistic organization called Rise Moldova caught wind of a separate transnational money laundering operation also involving Shor. It turned out that while the Shore Group was defrauding three banks out of $1 billion, a different bank, Moldova Bank, had laundered over $20.8 billion worth of Russian rubles in the same period. This was the Russian laundromat scandal, one of the biggest money laundering schemes in European history. Moldova was central to it, having been apparently chosen because its courts were corrupt, its local officials could provide cover, and because its banks were already connected to EU banking networks by way of Latvia. Those involved in the laundering had been compensated handsomely. Between 2011 and 2013, no less than $22 million from Russian companies wound up in the hands of the Shore Group. That is, in addition to the roughly $1 billion they'd made from their own scheme in the same period. The scale of the corruption and the fraud caused Moldova to erupt. But not quite in the way you might think. The thing is, as bad as all of this sounds for Ilan Shor, none of it was enough to immediately condemn him. Although he'd shown up in person to set up several of the fraudulent Latvian bank accounts, he chose to simply deny wrongdoing, and in some ways, it worked. At least initially. In 2014, shortly before the fraud was exposed, Shor was elected chairman of the board of directors at Banca de Economy. This despite him being a young businessman with no formal training or professional background in banking or finance. But nothing about Ilan Shor was surprising by this time. Although only 27 years old in 2014, Shor was used to living large. His ownership portfolio in Moldova included several companies and one of the country's top football teams, FC Milsami Ohai. His declared portfolio elsewhere included buildings and businesses in Russia and Kyrgyzstan. His wedding in 2011 had been a regal affair taking place in what was then the Moldovan Parliament building and attended by Moldova's President and Minister for Justice. He owned multiple cars and an Embraer private plane and was often seen at exclusive resorts abroad, especially in Israel, Russia, and Europe. But while Ilan Shor might have been living well, Moldova was not. Once the fraud was revealed, the country teetered on the brink of collapse. Millions of people's savings were on the line, so the Moldovan government was forced to step in with an $870 million emergency bailout to cover immediate liquidity. But it was divested from other public services to cover the cost, leading to the greater impoverishment of citizens dependent on those services and a greater rise in inequality. Public confidence in the banking system was shattered, and the state lost its fiscal credibility, impacting its ability to secure foreign investment. The Moldovan lei lost almost half of its value, and it was estimated that the state debt resulting from the fraud would take the Moldovan taxpayer roughly a quarter of a century to pay off. So, why weren't there immediate consequences for the man who was seen to be behind all of this? Well, the outrage generated by the scandal led to massive upheaval in Moldova. Protests broke out across the country, led by a grassroots movement called Dignity and Truth. Alternatively known as the Yes Platform, the movement morphed into a political party with a pro-European stance and a strong line against corruption. After a poor showing in the 2014 general election, it powered to more than 380,000 votes 5 years later, securing 25% of the ballot and 10% of the seats in parliament through an electoral alliance with the Liberal Party of Action and Solidarity. Their leader, Mayor Sandu, actually became the country's president in 2020. The outrage had led to a change in the political weather in Moldova and a rise in pro-Western, pro-EU sentiment as a response to the Russian-backed vultures who'd helped the fraud unfold. Yet Shor wasn't the first casualty of the fraud. Instead, former Prime Minister Vlad Filat was arrested in Parliament and was sentenced to 9 years in prison for having accepted bribes totaling 250 million euros from Shor. Filat claimed the charges against him were politically motivated, but his case wasn't helped by assets seized in the UK, which belonged to his son, including a luxury apartment in Knightsbridge and a £200,000 Bentley Bentayga. But the changing political climate came as a double-edged sword for Moldova's new leadership, since the Great Robbery had effectively wiped out any existing faith in government. Not only that, but they'd soon have to navigate the dangerous waters of the war in Ukraine in a country with a strong Soviet nostalgia, a breakaway Russian region on its territory with Russian troops stationed in it, and vulnerable to an invasion of its own should all else go south. In the meantime, 3 names were on the lips of every Moldovan: Shor, Vladimir Plahotniuc, and Sergei Ieralov. Plahotniuc was an archetypal local oligarch, wealthy and secretive, with multiple business pursuits and a strong hand in politics. Early in his professional life, he had been mentored by none other than Boris Berstein, the Kremlin-connected oligarch who'd been close with Ilan Shor's father, Miron. Plahotniuc became one of the most influential politicians in Moldova, being first elected to the state parliament in November 2010. Only a month later, he was given the lofty role of the parliament's first deputy speaker, a dubious position that vanished when Plahotniuc left the role in 2013. From the outset, his parliamentary tenure came with an obvious conflict of interest. Plahotniuc owned huge private business interests, including the General Media Group, the largest media empire in Moldova. He also had influence over the judiciary and police force and enormous sway within the erstwhile governing coalition, ironically entitled the Alliance for European Integration and led by the since-jailed Vlad Filat. As for Sergei Ieralov, not much was known about him, other than that he too was an affluent businessman seen as Plahotniuc's secondary. But what was known was that when former Prime Minister Filat implicated him as the mastermind in the fraud, Filat was quickly arrested, accused, and charged in connection with none other than the Great Robbery itself. Still, the reaches of the law did find their way to Shor. In 2015, he was placed under house arrest amid the probe into the scandal. He didn't stay there long due to another inglorious example of insider engineering. You see, under Moldovan law, political candidates enjoy immunity and cannot be arrested or face criminal charges. So, Shor simply went into politics. In July 2015, he stood as mayor of the city of Orhai, the same city whose football team he already owned, on a ticket belonging to the Russophile Equality Party. Despite his mayoral run occurring while he should have been under house arrest, Shor romped to victory in the election, receiving a landslide 62% of the vote and winning in the first round. It became apparent that corruption in Moldova was so endemic that the ballot didn't even need stuffing. Opinion polls held Shor as among the most popular politicians in Moldova, riding high on the residues of Russophia left over from the Soviet era and the support of a media empire run by his cronies. Shor made every possible move to keep his name in lights and caress the good popularity held among the pro-Russian population of Moldova. He built an enormous amusement park in Orhai, collectively named Orhailand, to which he offered free access for all. He also invested heavily in the region of Gagauzia, seen as a bedrock of pro-Russian sentiment in Moldova. Despite this, in 2017, Shor was convicted of money laundering for the Great Robbery. He received a 7.5-year sentence, but was placed, again, under house arrest, pending appeal. In 2019, he fled to Israel, becoming a fugitive from the law. Vladimir Plahotniuc also crawled out of Moldova, arriving in none other than the United States, where he boldly applied for political asylum. He was rejected and left the US. His whereabouts are currently unknown, but he is believed to be residing somewhere in Turkey. But somehow, even more twists to this story are yet to come. Before Shor fled Moldova, and while still undergoing trial for astounding fraud, he was elected as an MP on the Shor Party list. His status as a parliamentarian stood even while he was a fugitive, despite him being unable to attend parliamentary sessions in person. But the tides of change were coming, and eventually they were going to come for him. In 2020, Maia Sandu became the president, and a party, with the help of anti-corruption activists, went on to dominate the Moldovan parliament. But Shor wasn't done meddling. From his base in exile in Israel, he began stoking unrest back home with the help of his party, resulting in massive protests against the Sandu government in the following years. In 2021, Shor even secured parliamentary re-election, despite not having attended a single session since absconding. But the end for him and the party was in sight. In 2023, after months of Shor-engineered protests, the state finally had enough. The Constitutional Court of Moldova banned the Shor Party and forbade its members, including Shor, from standing for political office for 5 years. Around the same time, an appeals court squashed the challenge to the fraud conviction, froze his Moldovan assets, and increased his prison sentence to 15 years. The European Union also imposed sanctions against him, both due to his association with the Russian government and his role in the pro-Russian unrest in Moldova. Soon after that, Shor left Israel for Russia, where he was granted citizenship and is believed to reside to this day. Back in Moldova, it was the country's citizens who were left to eat the cost of Shor & Co.'s malevolence, and its impact continues to be harrowing. The billion-dollar hole left in the country's wealth and the years of hardship were not the end of the country's ills. When the war in neighboring Ukraine broke new ground with the 2022 Russian ground invasion, Moldova's prospects suffered even further. Energy provisions dried up, leading to rolling blackouts, power rationing, and electricity price spikes. The country had to rely on energy imports from the European market, often at higher prices. Foreign trade suffered as well. Ukraine, constituting roughly 70% of Moldova's land borders, was no longer a safe thoroughfare for Moldovan goods, especially with Russia, which had until then been one of Chisinau's largest trading partners. Sanctions on Russia also made the sending of remittances, a crucial form of income for destitute Moldovans with family in Russia, difficult. In 2022 alone, inflation in Moldova reached 30%, and by 2024, 1 in 3 Moldovans were living below the national poverty line. The atrocious economic conditions came hand in hand with a deteriorating political environment. After the bank fraud had been revealed, the Moldovan government was dismissed, resulting in a political vacuum filled by pro-Western groups. But not everyone saw those responsible for the bank fraud as responsible for the bank fraud. Shor and the pro-Russian cohort still held huge influence in Moldova, a legacy of the decades of Russian meddling in Moldovan affairs in the time since 1991. Not only that, but the hardships created by the energy crisis and falling trade caused extreme public anger among citizens, something Shor and the pro-Russian camp were all too happy to exploit. He continued to encourage protests against the government, especially in response to the energy crisis, and his supporters accused Sandu's government of incompetence and Russophobia by backing Ukraine against Russia. Shor provided monthly gas compensation payments to residents in Gagauzia and Orhai in a bid to shore up his support bases there, something shamelessly lauded on the Shor Party's official website. The anti-government protests continued, although they declined following the banning of the Shor Party in 2023, Shor's flight to Russia, and the expanded charges against him. Still, Shor has continued his scheming from abroad. In 2025, he gained notoriety for openly offering to pay Moldovans up to $3,000 a month to carry out protests against the government. In a country where the average wage is roughly $800 a month, where the rate of national poverty remains above 30%, and which has been blighted by the ongoing war on its flank, his efforts continue to risk more upheaval. Despite the scale of the fraud, none of the major players have yet served time in prison. Shor, despite his conviction, remains a fugitive. Plahotniuc was arrested in Greece in the summer of 2025, with Moldova actively seeking extradition at the time of writing. Sergei Irilov was never formally charged with the crime, although he remains at the center of several investigations. As for convicted former Prime Minister Filat, although he was sentenced to 9 years in prison, he was released in 2019 after 4.5. As political tensions grow across Europe, we're left wondering, will Ilan Shor, the mastermind of one of the greatest frauds in history, ever face justice? Thank you for watching.